Good afternoon. The title of this talk is Evolution of Stelling Minnis as Common Land, Ownership and Oversight. And its purpose is to explain the history of the Minnis as a manorial common and the development of its current status as land over which everyone has a right to take air and exercise, while the grazing and other registered rights of commoners continue to subsist. The Minnis is a manorial common, or more accurately, the waste of the manor of Upper Hards. The lords of the manor of Upper Hards are the Tomlin trustees, of whom I am one. Historically, the land of the lord of a manor was either domain land or waste. Traditionally, the lord would keep the best of the domain land for himself, managing it either in hand or through leases. He would then parcel out the remainder as freeholds to the freeman and copyholds to the bondsman. The remaining unproductive land of the manor was the waste. The waste of a manor was defined in the leading 19th century case on the subject as the open, uncultivated and unoccupied lands parcel of the manor other than the domain lands of the manor. This waste was part of and belonged to the lord of the manor, but was open to use by local people, and in the case of some but not all manorial wastes, rights of common evolved over time. Thus, an early medieval grant of arable to a freeman entitled him to the use of the manorial waste for such purposes as were necessary for the maintenance of his husbandry. These can colloquially be called shared rights of use. By far the most important right of common was the right of pasture, or the right to eat the grass with the mouths of his cattle, as it was charmingly put in one early legal text on the subject. Although there are other rights of common as well, such as piscary, the right to fish, pannage, the right to release pigs into wooded areas to feed off acorns, beech mast, etc., estovers, the right to take wood for building repairs and fencing, and turbary, the right to cut peat. This structure changed as enclosure became more prevalent. Historically, enclosure was a process by which common land and open fields came to be held separately, removing any traces of communal agriculture and extinguishing the common usage reflected in local people's rights of common. Throughout the 18th and early part of the 19th century, as the agricultural revolution took hold, this process increased dramatically, sweeping away in many parts of the country the local community's rights to communal use of any part of the land for basic agricultural purposes. In early times, enclosure was often achieved by agreement or by court order, but by 1700, the enactment of private acts of parliament was becoming the preferred process. Almost 4,000 were passed between the beginning of the 18th century and the enactment of a General Enclosure Act in 1845. In effect, what happened was that the open lands of the manor were redistributed and the waste of the manor was divided up, notwithstanding the objections of a minority of the local people. The rights of commoners were then extinguished. The procedures which were adopted meant that little attention was paid to the wider public interest. However, by 1876, the importance of unenclosed common land as a resource for the local community had become a more important policy objective than the consolidation of land use for more efficient farming purposes. Parliament legislated to prevent the approval of any further enclosure unless it was for the benefit of the neighbourhood. The position in metropolitan areas was already focused on recreation for the local population, but the focus on the benefits for local people in rural areas was largely concerned with the preservation of their rights of common. The position changed in the early 1920s with the far-reaching reforms of English property law. Amongst the many changes, all copyholds became freeholds, and the general enclosure of commons became all but obsolete. Section 194 of the Law of Property Act 1925 prohibited the erection of any fence by which access is restricted or impeded unless the consent of the Secretary of State is obtained. Obtaining a time-limited consent was one of the procedures which had to be undertaken recently before the managers were able to erect the fencing which was for some time on parts of the Minnis. Stelling Minnis itself survived the enclosure movement. This meant that more than 40 properties continued to have rights of common to graze their livestock and to gather wood, furze, and even peat. Since the enactment of the Commons Registration Act 1965, common land, including the waste of a manor, whether or not it includes shared rights of use, has been registrable. The 1965 Act also permitted the registration of rights of common. The register relating to the Minnis lists rights to graze 1,040 sheep, 133 cattle, 32 geese, 21 horses, 8 goats, 5 donkeys, and 2 pigs. These rights are protected by law, and any commoner is still entitled to exercise them at any time. They attach to the property listed in the register. One obvious consequence of this is that even though the Tomlin trustees are the freehold owners of the Minnis, their ability to exploit the land is restricted. However, if and to the extent that there is any surplus pasture after the commoners have exercised their rights, they are entitled to graze or harvest the pasture for themselves. As rights of common have rarely been exercised in recent years, the Tomlin trustees, through the managers as their agent, have exercised this right to the surplus when cutting and grazing the Minnis as part of the management programme and by permitting grazing through approved schemes administered by the managers. How then did the present position in relation to access develop? Prior to 1925, a manorial common in a rural area like the Minnis was not in any sense community land. The public at large had no general right to make use of it. The reference to such land being common was a reference to the fact that commoners had rights over the land, which they enjoyed in common with others. However, in practice, public access and indeed other forms of community use were commonplace. Fencing to stop the land being used by villagers would have obstructed commoners' rights, and more importantly, restrictions as to access were not regarded as important in the days when travel was restricted, and those who were likely to be accessing the land which was not agriculturally productive were members of the local community. However, as I have mentioned, the position changed in the latter part of the 19th century with a growing recognition that public access to common land, particularly in metropolitan areas, was an important public resource. This culminated in the enactment of Section 193 of the Law of Property Act 1925. This granted the public rights of access over common land to which the Act was applied for the purpose of taking air and exercise. There were a number of ways in which this could be done, but in a rural area the benefit of the Act could be applied by the lord of the manor, notwithstanding any objections by the commoners. In the case of Stelling Minnis, these rights of access were applied to the Minnis by the Tomlin trustees as lords of the manor in 1954, and at the same time the Minister of Agriculture made the bylaws which impose certain limitations on those rights, a copy of which is to be found on the village website, and which continue to be enforced to this day. The rights to air and exercise do not include the right to take vehicles onto the Minnis, nor do such things as light fires. The emission of carbon, which both these activities involved, is of course the antithesis of a right to air and exercise. The rights of the public to air and exercise are unchanged by the Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000, because while that legislation has granted rights of access over wide categories of land, including commons, common land to which Section 193 of the Law of Property Act applies, such as the Minnis, is not access land for the purposes of the 2000 Act, and the public's existing rights are neither affected nor supplemented by it. So who then are the present owners, and what is the history of their involvement with the Minnis? As I've already mentioned, the present legal owners of the manor of Upper Hards, and therefore the freehold of Stelling Minnis, are the Tomlin trustees, who technically are the trustees of my great-grandfather's will. He was a distinguished chancery judge, becoming a law lord in 1929. The Tomlins were an old Kent family who came from the Isle of Thanet, but the historic connection to Upper Hards and Stelling Minnis is traced back through Lord Tomlin's maternal grandfather, Canon Cheshire of Barton Court, Canterbury, now occupied by the grammar school of the same name. He was a canon of Canterbury Cathedral and a descendant of Sir William Hards, an MP and the father of the last member of the Hards family to live at Hards Court. Lord Tomlin was Sir William's five greats grandson. The lordship of the manor did not pass to Lord Tomlin by direct inheritance. It remained in the family, being held by members of the Huffam, Tazewell and Cheshire families until in 1907 the lordship was purchased within the family from the trustees of a family marriage settlement by Lord Tomlin's brother-in-law, William Arthur Lochet, who was a Canterbury solicitor. At about the same time, he acquired the manor house from the church. Until then it had been the rectory. On his death some 20 years later, in 1928, the lordship and the manor house passed from him to his widow, who was Lord Tomlin's sister, and then from her to Lord Tomlin. Lord Tomlin did not actually live at the manor house for very long, because he died when he was still at the height of his powers in 1935. However, my great-grandmother continued to live at the manor house until 1948. My father and uncle had very happy memories of summer holidays at the manor house. Those memories include not just the house, which was very old-fashioned in those days, but also trips to the Minnis by pony and trap before the war. By all accounts, it was a magical place for children, with a wonderful atmosphere. After my great-grandmother's death, the manor house itself was sold, but not all of the family's Kent property suffered the same fate. The lordship, together with the freehold of the Minnis and the advowson to the benefice of Upper Hards, was retained by the Tomlin trustees and continued to be held by them. The advowson, i.e. the right of a patron to present a new vicar to the benefice, still survives in the form of a right exercisable jointly with the Archbishop of Canterbury to present to the ecclesiastical benefice of Chartham and Upper Hards with Stelling. At least one member of the family in each succeeding generation has continued to retain a particular interest in the Minnis. First it was my grandmother, Lady Trower, who was Lord Tomlin's eldest daughter. Then it was my father, who was her eldest son. Finally, I have inherited the mantle. Although none of us have ever lived in Stelling Minnis, Bossingham or Upper Hards, we have each had a sense of belonging, derived, I suppose, from the length of the family's connection to the area. The Tomlin trustees have always sought to reflect this in their approach to the Minnis. So where does that leave us now? I've said this before, but I shall say it again. It leaves us with a number of diverse interests, giving rise to what I've always thought of as a subtle structure of checks and balances. The Tomlin trustees' rights as owners of the freehold are restricted, and heavily so, both by the rights of the commoners, which remain a preeminent right, and by the public's right to access for the purpose of taking air and exercise. On the other hand, the public's right of access can only be exercised for the purpose of taking air and exercise, and is subject to compliance with the bylaws, which are in part to ensure that the rights to graze and the right of pasture continues to be available to those entitled to use it, notwithstanding the public's right of access. The legal structure also explains one of the more misunderstood aspects of the Minnis, namely the role of the Minnis managers. As lords of the manor and freeholders of the land, the Tomlin trustees have the right to manage the Minnis, subject only to the legal rights of the commoners and the public. They do this through the Minnis managers, who act as their agents and who are appointed by them. While the Minnis managers will always strive to take into account and balance local views, and are highly public-spirited in the work that they carry out, they are in no sense public servants. Some may regard the existence of these contrasting and in some respects conflicting rights and roles as anachronistic. I think that on the whole they strike a respectable balance between the appropriate community use of common land and the continued existence of property rights in a form which assists in the proper management of the Minnis. Of course, the success of such a structure depends on the identity of those prepared to give their time and money to the management of this invaluable local resource. While there will always be some who are dissatisfied, the way in which the balance works at Stelling Minnis seems to me to be essentially positive, and so far as I can tell, has done much to enhance the quality and character of our surroundings. The reason for that is in large part driven by the work that is done on the Minnis and for the Minnis by so many local people. Thank you.